afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the City Club Forum. I'm Herb Cam, president of the City Club. Our speaker today is George A. Dalley, a member of the Civil Aeronautics Board. In a brief lifespan of 40 years, Mr. Dalley has indeed compiled an enviable record of public service. From 1973 to 77, he was administrative assistant to Congressman Charles B. Rangel of New York. From 1971 to 73, he was assistant counsel to the Judiciary Committee of the U.S. House of Representatives and was counsel to the Subcommittee on Civil Rights Oversight. He was appointed Deputy Assistant Secretary for Human Rights and Social Affairs in the State Department, and he became a member of the Civil Aeronautics Board on March 18, 1980, having been appointed by then Vice President Waller Mondale to complete the unexpired term of Alfred E. Kahn. Mr. Dalley was born in Cuba of Jamaican parents. He grew up and attended school in New York City, receiving his bachelor's degree from Columbia University in 1963. He also has a Master of Business Administration from the university, having obtained that in 1966. It is with a great deal of pleasure that I bring to you and our listening audience on radio and television Mr. George A. Dalley, member of the Civil Aeronautics Board in Washington. Mr. Dalley.
Thank you very much. My topic today is Sunbelt versus Snowbelt, the role of transportation. And my subtitle for that is, Should We All Move to Houston? I must say that this morning in my meeting with Mayor Voinovich, he suggested a retitling of that speech, which was Water Belt versus Drought Belt. And the answer to my subtitle was definitely no. So you folks in Cleveland have the right spirit, but today let me examine the role of transportation and see if we come out the same way as we look at the future, especially of air transportation for this city and for this area. It is a genuine pleasure for me to be here. I am privileged and honored to speak at the forum of the City Club of Cleveland, the oldest uninterrupted weekly current events forum in America. When this series commenced in 1912, Cleveland was an outstanding example of spectacular industrial growth in our country. And a booming industry meant a booming economy, an economy where everything, income, population, housing, was going up. An economy rich enough and with people far-sighted enough to build a transportation and public works infrastructure sufficient to support continued growth. It is not too much to say that Cleveland, and indeed the industrial United States, was the envy of the world. But today that is not the case, to say the least. And to say the most, or maybe to say the worst, some people think that the jig is up for old industrially based cities and regions. They are saying, in effect, move to Houston and the Sunbelt. Going beyond short-run general economic conditions, which have been negative for some time, and I'm afraid are growing worse, what does the future hold for Cleveland, its economy, and ultimately the people who live here? For well over a decade, and perhaps longer, a combination of events have not only stopped Cleveland's growth, but in fact have caused a decline, one that some people believe will continue and accelerate. You have heard these generally pessimistic predictions, I'm sure. Joel Garreau, in his book, The 9 Nations of North America, calls the American industrial belt, consisting of most of the Northeast and Midwest, the foundry. He says the economy of this area is based upon old primary manufacturing industries whose products are in decline, or which have been superseded by imports or substitutes, some of which are also imported. The McGill Report, addressing problems in the New York area, advocates that the government encourage migration to the Sunbelt. And some of you may have seen the November 9th cover story of Forbes, the business magazine, describing the theories of the Russian economist Nikolai Kondratyev, who said in the 1920s that world economic activity is governed by long-run cycles of boom and bust that are in large part outside of human control. The authors of the article speculate whether, under his theory, we are entering a long-run drought which might well continue for a decade or more. And if living in the foundry at the bottom of a Kondratyev cycle were not bad enough, Everyone here is acutely aware that since World War II, certain areas of the country have enjoyed huge success, while others have suffered at least a relative decline, and in some cases an absolute decline. The stark reality of these long-run changes has been recently confirmed by the 1980 census, which shows that the relative decline of the snowbelt and the relative ascendancy of the sunbelt is accelerating. In the snowbelt, many cities, including Cleveland, are in absolute decline measured by population, jobs, and housing. And it is clear that throughout much of the Northeast and Midwest, foundries and factories are in fact being abandoned as the old industries recede and as the rail system decays and remains poorly operated as a nationalized enterprise despite huge public subsidies. These changes, reversing almost 200 years of history and with few parallels elsewhere in the world, represent an extremely rapid and extraordinary turn of events. Most have taken place in the last 30 or 40 years. Prior to World War II, what is now called the snowbelt was, except for agriculture, the leading and dominant region by any economic measure. The Southwest was rural, a backwater, a place to be from rather than a go-to, exemplified to the rest of the nation by the literature of William Faulkner. All many of us knew of the West was that cowboys lived there, and California was Hollywood. For the snowbelt, these changes represent an astounding reversal of fortune. The Northeast Midwest Industrial Belt became the most important manufacturing area in the world, precisely because of the unequal skill of its people, and leaders in winning at the economic game of regional rivalry because of its ability to adapt quickly and in anticipation of coming events. Since the early 19th century, it grew at a faster rate to achieve and maintain a dominant position, which is only now eroding. How was this accomplished? Economic historians give much credit to the continuous creation of modern transportation infrastructure. The canals, the river and lake steamships in the early 19th century, the railroads after the Civil War, automobiles, and the road systems in the mid-20th century. Some of these were developed well ahead of existing requirements in anticipation of future needs. In fact, it was understood long before World War II and long before the General Motors exhibit at the 1939 New York World's Fair that the automobile and motor truck would become the new and dominant mode of surface transportation, and that the airlines would replace both the steamships and railroads for long-distance passenger travel. Accordingly, the major transportation investments were going into the development of the road systems and airports. This pattern accelerated during the whole period of the post-war boom from 1946 through the mid-70s. Beginning with the Eisenhower administration, construction of the interstate road system became a top priority of national policy. Matching funds were provided for expanding and perfecting the state road systems. Significantly, through this period, the real cost of road travel and the relative cost compared to competing modes was going down. Real fuel prices were declining. Automobile prices, after an adjustment for qualitative improvements, were declining. And improving roads and vehicles were allowing higher speeds, thereby reducing costs by the value of time saved in a period when rising real income had the effect of increasing the value of time. It is now clear that this fundamental transformation of the transportation infrastructure benefited the Sunbelt much more than the Snowbelt. For the Sunbelt, the creation of the National Highway System formed its first comprehensive transportation network. In the North, the same modern highway system doomed the existing comprehensive rail network and permitted the development of suburbs, which fatally weakened the older inner cities. And through possessing the transportation infrastructure for the first time, the Sun Belt was able to compete with the industrialized North for the first time. Given a much freer and less developed economy, almost all costs of doing business, including the tax burden, were lower. Costs in the North were also significantly affected by the degree of unionization, and unionization in turn was fortified by favorable local legislation and protection, the latter both legal and extra-legal. Of equal importance, much of the state and local regulatory apparatus in the snowbelt, although characterized as public interest legislation, was in fact intended to protect or benefit private interests, including the private interests of organized labor, by restricting competition and preserving the status quo. To a lesser degree, the same story applies to air transportation. Although airport construction, modernization, and expansion has occurred on a national scale with heavy federal participation, the Sun Belt has acquired a more extensive and efficient system relative to its population size. Because travel distances between communities of interest are greater in much of the Sun Belt, the growth of air travel as a public mode, displacing railroad passenger service, benefited that region relatively more. And those promoting the interests of the Sun Belt, including a vigorous group of federally licensed airlines, foresaw the decisive importance of air transportation for not only long-distance travel, but also for intra-regional travel. Atlanta, out of all proportion to its size, has become the second busiest airport in the world because it is the hub of a regional system serving the Southeast. In both California and Texas, entrepreneurs were permitted to establish airlines under state law that were so efficient that they were able to offer fares at about half the level prevailing in the North and the East. In recent years, revisionist criticisms have been put forward to the effect that urban, and to a lesser extent suburban and interurban transportation policy has been misdirected. It is argued that the large, high, and intermediate density transportation systems that were in place before the war, and which still exist in some large cities in the snowbelt, should have been expanded and modernized on a grand scale. While there may be some merit to these arguments, they are, broadly speaking, erroneous even as hindsight. Had the industrialized North not improved its road system, its decline would have been even more precipitous. The ascendancy of the automobile and motor truck in the post-war period occurred not only because of the political decision to build a road system — the automobile was, after all, the post-war promise and dream of America — but also because it was the most efficient mode of transportation. Moreover, the road system, even in and around cities, probably was constructed at lower capital costs than rebuilding, for example, the older subways along the lines of Washington's Metro, which every taxpayer really should see in order to believe. It was therefore inevitable that the Sun Belt would benefit disproportionately. What was not inevitable was the self-inflicted harm, the failure of the North to adjust to these changes. This may be illustrated by examining the fate of the railroads. Because of the combined effect of federal and state regulation and taxation, the railroads were not permitted to improve costs, including labor costs, and adjust rates and service in light of changing competitive and other conditions. In essence, they were not allowed to innovate and modernize beyond their 19th century niche, for example, by combining truck and rail operations. The result was a collapse, and Conrail and Amtrak, whose day of reckoning is now at hand. What other possible explanation is there for the degeneration of a railroad system which has been serving the most concentrated area of industrial activity in the world? The decline, both relatively and absolutely, of industrial activity may be explained on similar grounds. Government intervention, including taxation, had the effect of not only increasing costs by discouraging innovation and flexibility, but, more important, it diminished the ability of all industry to adapt to changing conditions and hindered the development of new industry. In a nutshell, by failing to reward or allow entrepreneurial initiatives, the snowbelt has suffered and continues to suffer at least a relative decline. And in the case of old industries which cannot meet regional and foreign competition, textiles, steel, and automobiles, for example, an absolute decline. We are now, however, at another turning point, one that may be more important than the post-war period for Cleveland and the snowbelt generally. The fundamental driving force of the post-war boom, declining real energy and petroleum prices, is at an end. The country is now in a massive search for new sources of energy, for substitutes, and for conservation measures in response to rapidly increasing real prices. All other things being equal, This basic change should be of net benefit to the snowbelt in the transportation sector, given that the rise of the sunbelt was based on a mode, road transportation, whose comparative advantage is or may be declining for the first time. But all other things are not equal, because the sunbelt enjoys still a much greater freedom to adapt to what is, after all, the only constant, change. It is in recognition of this fundamental fact that the snowbelt is undertaking basic reform in regulation, taxation, and governmental intervention generally. In my view, this is the correct response. The snowbelt must disenthrall itself, to use Lincoln's word, from constraints that are not safety-related or required to protect environmental integrity. And remaining constraints must be efficiently designed to be flexible and cost-effective by offering alternatives and incentives. Above all, they must be applied after a careful appraisal of costs and benefits, which will unmask their improper use as protective devices to benefit special sectors of the economy at the expense of the general economy. If the snowbelt can begin to move in this direction, it will gradually reduce the now increasing relative advantage of the sunbelt and restore its economic health. The federal government, beginning very selectively under the Ford and Carter administrations, and now in policies that are being applied across the board by the Reagan administration, has adopted deregulation as a principal policy goal. To the extent this goal is achieved consistent with prevailing social standards for the protection of safety and the environment, the snowbelt should benefit to a greater extent than the sunbelt. These gains can be enhanced and speeded up if states and cities adopt policies that coincide with the national goals, and if they fully support deregulation politically at the national level. Airline deregulation is the outstanding example already in place. Here, the unprecedented Airline Deregulation Act of 1978 not only deregulated entry, exit, and prices, but preempted state jurisdiction over these matters. Because the national policy of airline deregulation was imposed on the states, they do not have the task of deregulating themselves. Whether such a policy will be pursued generally, and it has not been in the case of trucking, is yet to be resolved in light of another principal policy, requiring or restoring state jurisdiction over many areas now directly or indirectly regulated by the federal government. But it is clear that the North should support federal preemption in order to avoid local political battles with the entrenched beneficiaries of regulation at the state and local levels. Because airline deregulation is new and has been implemented on a phased basis, its impact in most of the snowbelt has been confined to volatile price competition between the larger, older carriers in a number of dense, long-haul markets to and from the sunbelt, principally Florida, and on the transcontinental routes. In part, this competition has been stimulated by the appearance of new entrants, such as Air Florida and World Airways, which are attempting to serve the most price-sensitive components of these larger, long-haul markets. These, and the realistic threat that new, similar carriers, as well as charter airlines, can now enter the business in the routes at any time, assure that very low prices relative to the cost of providing service will be a permanent feature in most of the large, long-haul markets. At the other end of the market spectrum, short-haul, low-density markets, commuter carriers using small aircraft continue to expand, offering service wherever it can be provided profitably. Except for distortions caused by the controller strike, which in any event are short-run in character, these carriers are performing equally throughout the country in terms of service and price. This may be ascribed to the fact that commuters had never been subjected to federal economic regulation, and in the snowbelt remained relatively free of state protective regulation. The commuter sector of the market is, however, very small, less than 1% of the revenue passenger miles generated by the whole industry. Today, the most rapidly growing airline markets are the dense short-haul routes, the distances of under 500 miles, served by small jets, principally the Boeing 737 and the Douglas DC-9. These are primarily intra-regional markets, markets within the snowbelt or the sunbelt. Altogether, these comprise about 11% of the total revenue passenger miles, or 25%, counting short-haul passengers who are connecting to another flight. For this category of travel, large portions of the sunbelt have been much better served than the North for many years. Beginning just after World War II, PSA and other interstate carriers in California quickly established high-quality service, which was offered at prices that were one-half the rate prevailing elsewhere in the country. And these prices were matched by the larger interstate carriers, but only in California. About 10 years ago, the same thing happened in Texas, when Southwest Airlines established an intrastate system. Today, Southwest enjoys a cost structure that makes it more than 50% more efficient than the older airlines, which in turn permits Southwest to offer airfares that are 50 to 70% cheaper than the average elsewhere for comparable distances. How is it possible for Southwest's cost to be more than 50% below the level of the older carriers? There are two basic answers: economies deriving from specialization and high-volume operations. Southwest concentrates on providing high-frequency service to local rather than connecting traffic, and in so doing offers passengers simplified cash register ticketing. More important, service need not be provided at major airports which permit passengers to connect to other flights. Any conveniently located airport, or even remote gate space at major airports, can be utilized, including secondary, less crowded facilities. And because Southwest does not offer food service, it has removed galleys and installed extra seats. Southwest Airlines averages 118 seats on its Boeing 737s versus 103 for the older airlines in their most usual first-class coach configuration. And primetime flights are geared to meet the travel time requirements of local residents for convenient schedules, with non-business traffic encouraged by much lower prices to utilize off-peak flights, including all weekend services. As a result, load factors are high in all flights, and aircraft and gate space can be utilized to the maximum. Southwest flies its 737s 9.25 hours a day, compared to between 6 or 7 hours for the older trunk carriers. Because of high volume made possible by low prices, Southwest is able to utilize all of its resources, human and material, more efficiently. Labor contracts and compensation policies are designed to provide incentives for high and improving productivity. For example, pilots are paid by the trip, and as a result, average 75 hours flying time a month versus 40 or 50 hours for many of the older airlines. Based on unit labor cost figures, Southwest's employees are more than twice as productive as airline employees generally. Only part of this advantage is due to lower wages, whether resulting from low seniority levels or otherwise. The Southwest formula has resulted in large profits for the carrier and full recognition by Wall Street that it is a growth stock investment. As a consequence, Southwest is able to raise capital, including equity capital for expansion, and it is doing so. Only a company policy not to expand too rapidly, by more than 33% a year, has held back even higher growth for this airline. The success of Southwest explains why it is that about 8 new airlines, in addition to those already flying, are on the verge of obtaining venture and equity capital to start up similar operations. And this is occurring all over the country in a period of economic decline. Moreover, it is fair to say as a generalization that the whole group of the non-trunk group, commuters such as Allegheny Commuter System and Freedom, former local service carriers such as US Air, and the new cost structure airlines such as People Express and New York Air I have been discussing, are prospering and growing. This growth is in sharp contrast to the large trunk airlines, the Easterns, the Braniffs, the Americans, and others, many of which are losing money and almost all of which are growing smaller at a rapid rate. In fact, the non-trunk group is growing at an annual rate of something like 15% a year, while the large trunk group is contracting at an annual rate of approximately 10%. And While the trunk group still retains over 80% of the domestic market, it is clear that at these rates of change, the non-trunk airlines can surpass the trunk airlines in just a few years. And like Southwest, Wall Street recognizes these fundamental structured distinctions. If you look at the stock prices of the non-trunk airlines that are traded, such as Piedmont and Frontier, they are, in general, performing much better than the trunks. This means that they will be able to raise capital to buy new airlines and expand during the next decade. And the trunks, if these trends continue, will not. Excuse me. However, all of this is subject to change. It may well be that the trunk carriers will achieve the new cost structure, as several are attempting to do now. Nevertheless, there seems to be a basic distinction between long-haul travel, which the trunks specialize in serving, and short-haul travel, which the non-trunk group serves. The latter will benefit from a modal shift from surface to air, which is to say, from the automobile to the airplane, and the former will benefit much less. Of course, all of this is subject to short-term constraints imposed by the Federal Aviation Administration at 22 major airports because of the Controller Job Action. In the very short run, this has skewed some of the trends. For example, U.S. Air has been seriously impacted because of the high proportion of controlled airports that it serves, and newer low-cost, low-fare airlines, such as New York Air and People Express, have been adversely affected through having to cut back on already started services, as well as delaying the inauguration of planned service. Now, because of deregulation, Southwest-type, high-volume, low-fare services are beginning in the north, and more are proposed. They have not appeared everywhere yet. On the contrary, except for the Texas area, these services are being provided in only a handful of cities scattered around the country. In this respect, Cleveland is well ahead of most of the larger industrial cities in the Northeast Midwest industrial belt. And Cleveland is not only the beneficiary of new services provided by two of the new airlines to emerge, Midway and New York Air, but it is also the test bed for an experiment by the largest of the older carriers, United Airlines, in providing a similar type of no-frills, low-priced, short-haul regional air service called Friendship Express. In just a few months, the results of this type of low-peak, off-peak fare service in a few markets are no less than spectacular. Non-stop flights to such major communities of interest as Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Washington have increased in this area from 9% up to 53% compared to November of last year. The new low fares that have been introduced in these markets and to Chicago are substantially increasing traffic by, as I said, up to 53% in the New York market, and 19 points of load factor for United to Boston in the latest period for which data is available. Will the new airlines and the new low-fare experiment by United be successful? First, it is not easy to start a new airline, and it is probably doubly hard to start on a large scale, as proposed by New York Air and People's Express. Assuming that managers are competent and financing is adequate, however, what would prevent the cloning of Southwest Airlines throughout the North, which, in fact, in reality, has a much larger passenger base from which to work and which to exploit? Number one, public acceptance. Will the public patronize new low-fare service? Even those who are not bona fide supply-siders would have no difficulty in predicting that if the price is low and the quality is right, big and growing patronage will develop very quickly. In fact, there is every reason to believe that a major modal shift will occur from the automobile to air travel. This could cause a dramatic expansion in air traffic, and this might well occur even if general economic and air travel trends are negative, as they are now. Number two, competition. Existing airlines may undercut, at least temporarily, their prices to put the new carriers out of business. Here, historic precedent in California and Texas argues that for both economic and legal reasons, such efforts will not be successful. On the contrary, the older airlines will themselves have to adapt to the new cost structure to survive in the long run. And United is taking the very first of these steps right now with its Friendship Express experiment. And the experience in Texas, and very recently in New York and Cleveland, suggests that traffic will grow very rapidly, providing more than sufficient business for both the new and the old airlines at the lower price. This was clearly the case with regards to New York Air's entry into the New York-Washington market, where the shuttle has continued to thrive and prosper, and New York Air has been successful in attracting, it appears, a much larger market segment than one would have originally anticipated from people who were not flying the shuttle, perhaps because of the cost considerations. Number 3, labor acceptance. Already the pilots union, the Airline Pilots Association, has embarked on a campaign to organize the new airlines and to combat what they call substandard wages. Here, organized labor and the country will be presented with an extremely difficult question, which is now being faced by American automobile manufacturers. Namely, what happens to compensation rates that are above, and in some cases well above, the market for similar skills? In the airline business, wages as well as work rules for specialized airline skills were put into place during the long regime of governmentally imposed protective regulation between the passage of the Federal Aviation Act of 1938 and 1978, when the Airline Deregulation Act was passed. As a result, the older airlines are paying pilots between $60,000 and $125,000 a year to fly less than 50 hours per month. But other pilots, now unemployed or underemployed, and with equal qualifications under FAA requirements, are willing to work 80 hours a month for $30,000 or less. In fact, the evidence has for some years pointed to the fact that the combined effect of labor laws and protective regulation within the airline industry, which prevented new airlines from entering the business, has been to increase wages to twice the market level. Although not as extreme, the wages of other airline specialties, principally cabin attendants and mechanics, are similarly inflated in today's market. Now new airlines can enter and puncture the wage balloon, as well as its close cousin, restrictive work rules. The net result is that unit labor costs, what labor costs to produce a revenue passenger mile, are less than half for a new airline of the prevailing industry average. Because the cost of labor is about 40% of total airline costs, it is clear that the success of the new airlines, and ultimately the survival of the old airlines, will depend on their ability to keep labor costs at or near the market level. Of course, actual wages can be higher, as they are at Southwest, if the employees are able to work hard enough in the absence of inhibiting work rules to keep costs per unit of output low. And the key is going to be cross-utilization of personnel and the ability to use personnel more efficiently. Number 4, weather. Because average weather conditions in the north are worse than in the southern part of the country, it costs more to fly in the north. While this is a disadvantage, one estimate is that direct operating costs are about 8% higher in this region than it is in the south. It is not, in and of itself, of such magnitude that airfares should be anything but marginally higher in the snowbelt. The 5th constraint concerns airports, saturation, congestion, and ground access, and the Federal Aviation Administration capacity constraints imposed because of the traffic controller situation. Here, the North faces both long-term and short-term problems. Southwest Airlines operates at airports that are neither saturated nor congested, and which possess convenient ground access. The company decided against serving Denver because its airport lacked free gate capacity and would not permit fast turnarounds and schedules timed for zero or very low aircraft ground and airborne traffic delays. In other words, Southwest's low costs, which are based on the optimum use of the fleet, would not be possible at Denver. However, Denver is the exception rather than the rule in the West and the Sun Belt generally. By and large, the Snow Belt has fewer airport resources than the Sun Belt. Today, most congested airports, which are defined in terms of airborne or ground delay of aircraft, and all the saturated airports, which are airports subject to rationing procedures, such as National, O'Hare, LaGuardia, Kennedy, are in the north. Even without a rapid expansion of short-haul travel, increasing congestion will place the north at a serious and increasing disadvantage. But if short-haul travel could double or triple in the next 5 years, or even sooner, the north will have to proceed simultaneously along several fronts. First, there are various ways in which existing airports can be modified to accommodate a larger number of flights and airlines. Several of these require capital and technological improvements. In this area, the leading airport authorities in the north may be expected to keep abreast or ahead of the state-of-the-art in implementing these measures, as they have done historically. In other areas, on the commercial side, less than the most advanced thinking is being applied. Part of the problem here is that the older airlines often have been airport tenants for 50 years or more. This creates the illusion in the minds of airport operators that they are permanent and new airlines are transient, when, in fact, the opposite may be the case. In making allocative choices of any character among competing airlines, it is in the best interest of the airport and the community it serves to select airlines that will most rapidly expand the market for air travel, and political and public pressure will reflect this fact. These areas of improvements are, however, quite secondary to the long-run question of the ability of the airport system to handle a greatly expanded volume of operations. Here there are only two possibilities: build new, long runway airports, or develop new technology, short takeoff and landing aircraft, which can use short runway airports. Probably both will be required, but the premise of stall and short runway airports adjacent to or independent of main airports is the most promising for short-haul air travel. These would be highly efficient, specialized aircraft. They would operate over routes ranging between 500 and 50 miles, and as such would probably be quieter, slower, and lower flying than current fixed-wing designs. Given that both specialized stall airports are well within the state of the technological art, it will be possible to build very economical, large and small vehicles with capacities of up to 300 seats and beyond that could operate from, for example, 2,000 to 3,000 feet riverside runways on each side of Manhattan. Similarly, such aircraft could relieve congestion at the main airports by using complementary short runways, taxiways, and traffic control systems. All of this is, of course, some years off and will not take place until present facilities are at or nearing saturation. Meanwhile, however, the central fact is that specialized short-haul service offered to local passengers can be provided at any uncongested facility, so long as it is convenient in terms of ground access. The synergism of a large connecting pattern is unnecessary, nor is centrally located gate space. Midway Airport, which is in the city of Chicago and much closer to the business center than O'Hare, is serving as the base of operations of Midway Airlines, a new entrant which is patterned after Southwest. While New York Air's initial operations have been in congested or saturated airports, its principal operations and People's Express's only operations in the New York metropolitan area will eventually be conducted at Newark International, because only that airport is uncongested and yet close in. The decline of Cleveland has been real and obvious. This is, however, deceptive. Part of the metropolitan area is thriving and growing. Some sectors are booming. And elsewhere in the north, there are bright spots. For example, in the Boston metropolitan area and beyond, new technology industries are expanding. In New York, hotels, theater, the arts, and entertainment generally are doing very well. Similarly, certain administrative areas such as financial, advertising, and corporate headquarters are growing. Yet throughout the snowbelt, the transportation infrastructure is not keeping pace with the sunbelt. The principal development now that the automobile is in relative decline, intra-regional short-haul air travel is well ahead in large parts of the sunbelt. Now this is about to change, however, and in fact is in the process of changing. Enough uncongested airports exist in the north for these operations, and others still to come, to succeed at a rapid pace if local airport and governmental authorities take every reasonable step to facilitate both startup and expansion. If new airlines modeled on Southwest Airlines, both in respect to costs and prices, are able to successfully mount large-scale and expanding operations in the North, the older existing airlines will gradually adapt to the new cost and price structure. This process, too, is beginning now and could be well along within 5 years, although, as noted, the process may be aborted or slowed because of the current existing air traffic capacity limitations. What will be its impact? Transportation is a multiplier for the economy as a whole. In the words of Hans Hyman, transportation is the indispensable ingredient, the prerequisite, the catalyst that makes possible and promotes all other economic activity. The external economies of high-frequency, very low-priced, convenient air service are virtually incalculable. Ask yourself, how will both the businessman and each of us in the pursuit of leisure activities react to the availability of air service that is priced well below the cost of driving an automobile? In the most literal sense, the cities of the North can be in each other's backyard, within an hour's travel time, airport to airport. Business activity and business travel, and leisure activity and leisure travel could well increase by several times over present levels, and in just a few years' time. If this happens, it is possible that we are in the very early stages of a major modal shift. In the past, such shifts occurred gradually, taking at least 2 decades or more to gain momentum. The rail-to-auto shift took 3 to 4 decades. And also, based on past experience, such shifts occur only at long intervals, ordinarily taking 50 years or more. If such a shift is again in the offering, we shall know it by the rapid saturation of airports in the North. As this occurs, the new short takeoff and landing aircraft and airport systems must be put into place. In place, suburban residents will be able to travel from an airport near their homes to midtown and downtown areas in 20 minutes and in complete comfort. Combined with deregulation and tax abatement, Cleveland and the Snow Belt generally will grow and prosper and give the Sun Belt a real run for its money. So my advice is, don't move to Houston. Stay and take part in a very bright future that will happen for Cleveland and the other cities of the Sun Belt, if we can make it happen. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Dalley. Today at the Cleveland City Club Forum, our guest is George A. Dalley, a member of the Civil Aeronautics Board. In just a moment, we'll have our traditional question and answer session, but first, let me make a few brief announcements. I think all of you are aware that our membership drive is underway. As a matter of fact, it was heightened the other night here at the City Club headquarters with a delightful wine and cheese party. We had everything going but a kissing booth. And as a matter of fact, judging by some of my amorous activities, my wife thought we did have a kissing booth going. So you never know what you find in the way of pleasant surprises here at the City Club, and I urge each and every one of you who is a member to do all you can to bring in at least one member. We also have underway at this time a fund drive by the City Club Forum Foundation, our right arm in many ways, led by that distinguished jurist, member of the law profession, Peter de Leon, seated here at the round table. So any contribution you can make to the City Club Foundation helps us maintain our forum and will be gratefully received by all of us. Today, as always, we have students with us who are participating in our Living Seminars program, which we sponsor in cooperation with the Cleveland Public Schools and with the support of Sohio. With us now are students from the following high schools: Collinwood, John F. Kennedy, Maple Heights, Mayfield, Solon, Valley Forge, and Westlake. Will they stand, please, and acknowledge, have us acknowledge their presence? As is our custom, they will be meeting with a speaker for a seminar of their own after this session. Next week, because of the Thanksgiving holiday, We shall have no forum, but we'll be on the radio as usual, this time with a rebroadcast of the address delivered here last April by Dr. Helen Caldecott, the National President of Physicians for Social Responsibility. Her topic is medical implications of nuclear war. You may recall that she delivered a very memorable address here, and we received well over 100 requests for this tape from all over the country. The reaction to her speech, as a matter of fact, was the greatest that we've had in the last 10 years. 2 weeks from today, our speaker will be Dr. John F. McCarthy, the director of the NASA Lewis Research Center right here in Cleveland. You can make your reservations today for this very important forum, and I'm sure you're going to find him a delightful speaker. We've had 2 flights of Columbia since Dr. Lewis was last here, if he was here at all, and I know you're going to be interested in what he has to say. Now for questions for Mr. George Dalley of the CAB. We have 2 microphones, one in front with Alan Davis, our executive director, and one at the rear with Bob Conrad. Please raise your hand, make your questions brief as possible.
There was an article in the Wall Street Journal this last week about an airline in Texas called Muse Airline for non-smokers only. Do you think we non-smokers should finally have our way and let the other smokers fly the friendly skies of Emphysema Airline?
I think under deregulation, one should see the kind of development we saw with Muse Air. I think that management should be free to offer all non-smoking flights, and even if they want to, all smoking flights, because it seems to me that is the essence of competition, and one should be offering a variety of services. I was part of a minority on the board recently that voted in favor of us allowing airlines now to decide their own smoking rules, not to have mandatory non-smoking sections, because I think that under deregulation, airlines should be making that decision, and that should be a competitive decision. The majority of the board, though, still feels that the federal government should decide who sits where in an airline, and I don't really think that's the role that we should be playing.
I read about the air cargo industry, and I was wondering, from some of the figures that have come across my desk, as you said, because of competition and the new smaller airlines, prices have gone down. But in many cases, load factors have not increased. They have either stayed the same or, in fact, have gone down. Now, from your speech, I would guess that, are you seeing a better future for that, or load factors going up? Because it's not happening as far as I can see.
I think you have to look at the market, and you have to also understand the historic cyclical nature of the industry, which I'm sure you do. Load factors are bad now because we're in an economic recession, and transportation and especially leisure travel has always preceded, dips in that have preceded an economic recession and certainly been highly influenced by it. I think in the long term, we are going to see that the markets that are going to be, the ones I was talking about, the short-haul ones, subject to this kind of low-fare stimulus, will prosper, and they will be stimulating new traffic. Certainly the Washington-New York market is provably such a case. The initial mid-Atlantic markets and North Atlantic markets were that way. I think the sluggish you see now is due to economic considerations, more than it is the tendency for fares, lower fares, to have no effect on the market. I think they do have an effect on the market and will do so over the long run. People's Express, I believe, again, is another case in point where lower fares are stimulating people out of their cars and out of the bus system into the air.
Mr. Dalley, you mentioned the fact that the short-haul airlines pay pilots by the trip, and they are flying more hours. What is the safety record of the short-haul airlines?
It has been good. There has been no accident, actually, in the United States or in commercial aviation in the last 2 years, I believe the figure was. It was just a spate of news stories about this being a new record a couple of weeks ago since the unfortunate crash of Western Airlines in Mexico City. The short-haul carriers, the ones that I was speaking about, have not had any accidents. When one thinks of 80 hours a month, one is talking about, I think, a time frame that still provides a great deal of time for pilots to rest. Most of us work 40 hours a week, and the fact that people cannot fly a plane more than 40 hours per month is something I've always had a hard time understanding.
I would be curious to know what sort of future you'd predict for U.S. airlines, United States Airlines, competing in the international market against a lot of the highly subsidized air firms from various other countries.
That's harder to predict because of the complexity of the international market. Obviously, you have a mixed, as your question implied, situation where the United States Airlines are subject to competition, not only because of deregulation, but because of our system. We've never had a designated airline, a single airline, as most other countries do, to represent us internationally. I believe in the long run, if economic rationality is going to be the basis for decision-making in other countries, as it eventually must be, we will end up with a deregulated system, a system in which foreign governments are going to find that they are going to want to limit the amount of subsidies they pay. They're going to have to subsidize maybe certain domestic services for security and other reasons that they would have within their own countries. But to continue to subsidize leisure travel markets and international markets would not make sense for countries that are going to be under severe budgetary squeezes. We think that ultimately the subsidy bills are going to get too high for foreign governments to continue. If a foreign government wants to make the decision and doesn't have the political need to lower that subsidy cost, then ultimately the U.S. airline will be harmed by the fact that they will continue to be undercut because of government subsidy. We don't think that foreign governments can afford to do that indefinitely.
Mr. Dalley, as a poor consumer and passenger who likes to get to places in one piece, I worry about this great deregulation movement to increase profits. Are there safety measures which could be introduced into the airplane and the airports which are available but not being put in place now because of the costs to government and to private industry? And what do you want to do about, what are you going to do about that if there are?
I've been convinced, and I don't want to claim to be an expert on airline safety. I don't have a background in that area, and I, of course, don't work at the Federal Aviation Administration. But I have been convinced, since I have been at the board, that this industry is committed to safety. It has been so historically and remains so. That despite the great losses, there is no tendency to cut back on maintenance or other safety-related factors. Also, with regards to the FAA, I've been convinced that despite the great political pressures to increase service in the light of the restrictions placed upon us by the air traffic controllers' walkout, the FAA is resisting those and is trying to operate a system that will be consistent with the maximum level of safety. The new computerized control systems that are going into place are not only in response to the strike, they were planned beforehand as a way to increase the aids of the controller in separating traffic. And I think that we do have a system that is about as safe as the level of technology right now permits it to be. I think one has to recognize, though, that there would be, in the long term, as we move towards a stronger economy, hopefully, and the proliferation of general and business aircraft and aviation that is non-commercial in nature, will probably have to be tighter constraints. You're going to have more congested areas and more rules are going to have to be developed to make certain that that other kind of traffic does not mix with the commercial traffic. But at the present time, I feel no worry at all about flying, and I don't think the general public should.
Apparently what you've described is a interregional proliferation of air traffic, which means that we ought to have some more regional airports. A few years ago, you may recall that there was a regional airport proposed in our lake, Lake Erie. Apparently, you might be a proponent of that, and we certainly would elicit your support in Washington as a part of the CAB, which was one of the agencies that seemed to spell a quietus on it. But I'd like to point out that some of the timing that you also point out seems to describe Cleveland very aptly, since we were the only U.S. airport that has got ground transportation 22 minutes away from the heart of the city, as well as the potential for a regional airport that would decongest about 3 of those airports that you've described: LaGuardia, Chicago, and so on.
Yes. Well, I just say, without taking position on the Lake Airport, that Cleveland, is very well positioned because of the fact that you just mentioned. Close-in airport as well as an airport that is linked by rapid transit to the center of the city. And those are unique, not unique assets, but they're very important assets as you compete for industry and for the kind of economic development that will enhance the city.
Mr. Dalley, one of the factors you haven't discussed is international travel, and of course that's one thing that we lack here in Cleveland at the moment, direct international flights. Would you care to comment upon the benefits of having direct intercontinental and international connections as far as the future of Cleveland is concerned?
I think it's an obvious benefit. You give me a chance to get controversial. I am a supporter and an enthusiastic advocate of our deregulation policy, including in the area of international aviation. This was pursued vigorously under Fred Kahn and Marvin Cohen under the Carter administration. The new administration, even though continuing to adhere publicly to the free market philosophy and to deregulation, has been sending some signals that we are going to be no longer willing to grant access to internal gateways or new access to the United States by foreign carriers, which is a trade that basically permitted Atlanta, Minneapolis, Denver, Pittsburgh, and other cities to get to direct service. The administration is a bit schizophrenic. They want to protect the Pan Ams and the TWAs and others that are under pressures right now and are losing money. And what has resulted as a result of that policy or that non-policy has been a bit of an atrophying of our commitment to open up new gateways and to make those kinds of trades. And until we can sort out what the policy is going to be, we are not going to have the continued movement we've had towards providing access to places like Cleveland to direct international travel.
George, real quickly, to answer your question, from an airport stand of view, safety is number one, bottom line is number two, in all our thinking. Second, Cleveland to some extent, Akron, Youngstown, Erie, and go through the country have been very severely hurt by this deregulation. Is there anything in your thinking that can bring these cities back quicker than just the norm?
I think that the return of the level of service that existed before is going to be slow, because the level of service in the past was somewhat unrealistic based on political factors that are typical of a regulated environment. The congressman who has a district and is able to convince a carrier to put in a DC-9. I think what deregulation was intended to do was to provide an economic level of service for those communities with an essential air service program which would last for 10 years as a bridge. I think that what Congress will have to do, since in those areas where we see that the growth is not as what it should be, and of course the air traffic control situation has exacerbated it, is to extend the essential air service program for a longer period of time to guarantee that service until economically viable service comes in. Thank you.
Thank you, George Dalley, member of the Civil Aeronautics Board. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. The City Club Forum is adjourned.